now I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Katie LaBarbera. Katie received her bachelor's in biology from Cornell University, where she studied house wrens. She then moved here to the Bay Area to get her PhD in integrative biology from UC Berkeley, and she studied the life history variation in dark-eyed juncos in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And I noticed that some people said that their favorite birds among them were juncos, so that's great. After completing her PhD, she continued teaching at UC Berkeley, and then she did her postdoc at the University of Minnesota to study tree frog communication. So she is actually calling in from Minnesota right now, but she'll be here in the Bay Area very soon. Having previously been a volunteer bird bander at our Coyote Creek Field Station, she is now a senior biologist at SFBBO. So Katie, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I'll have you take it away.
Thanks so much, Serena. Let me just share my screen. As Serena said, I'm Katie LaBarbera. I'm a senior biologist at San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory now. And tonight I'd like to talk to you about what we can learn by catching birds. Before I dive into that, however, I want to address something that I know if I was watching this talk would be on my mind, which is, are the birds okay? Is it okay to be catching the birds? Because when you say we're catching birds, maybe it makes you think, you know, oh no. So I want to say absolutely yes. Anytime that we catch birds, the bird safety is the top priority. Anything that SFBBO does, any project I've been on, we are very, very careful to make sure that for the birds, this is maybe a stressful 10 minutes in their lives, but that's it. And then everything else is the same. So to make sure the birds are okay, we train anyone who's gonna handle the birds really extensively, like for many months before they are a bird bander. We watch the birds carefully. You can tell if birds are starting to get stressed out. There are little behaviors that they do, and we watch for those, and if the bird starts to stress out, we'll release it. And maybe most importantly, we don't catch birds just for kicks, just for fun. We only catch birds when we're gonna get data from catching them that we think will benefit the birds such that it's worth it. So the rest of the talk will be about what data we can get, but just in general, data for conservation, data for understanding the things that impact birds, these will all benefit bird populations. And so we judge that it's worth a little bit of temporary stress to individual birds to be able to conserve the future of birds. In this talk today, I'm going to illustrate things using photos from some of my research. So photos from banding at the Coyote Creek Field Station, that is SFBBO's field station. Also photos from my dissertation work, and photos from some banding I did in Ecuador. In these photos, you'll generally see birds held in one of these two grips, the bander's grip or the photographer's grip. If you're used to thinking about mammals, these grips might look a little weird to you. I don't recommend trying to hold your cat with either of these grips. It will not like it. But because birds are structured pretty differently from mammals, these are very established, safe ways to hold the birds. So I just want to say up front, you'll see pictures of the birds being held this way. That's on purpose. These are good, safe grips. There are a few species that you can't hold this way, and so those species have their own grips. For example, hummingbirds are so tiny with their teeny little legs that you can't hold them that way, and so they get their own special grip, the hummingbird grip. Now, I mentioned that birds are built differently from mammals, and I want to just go into that a little bit more. So here's a western flycatcher from Coyote Creek Field Station, pretty typical looking songbird. And I'd like you to just take a second and think about what do you think that bird looks like underneath its feathers? If you got it really wet so that all its feathers were drenched, what would be the shape of it? right? The same way, if you have a fluffy cat and you get it wet and it shrinks to like a third of its size, what would this bird look like? Here's an artist's depiction of what it would look like. Underneath their feathers, birds are maybe somewhat unexpectedly shaped. They're sort of a big ball of muscle in the middle for flying. So those breast muscles there are flight muscles. The wings are actually pretty small if you take away the feathers. The legs are very long and thin. And then the neck here is folded up. So the bird is sort of hunched down, its neck, but they can stretch it out and they actually get quite long. So birds can look like they have pretty short necks, but they actually have these long necks that they've scrunched down. Yeah, so birds are sort of a funny shape. This matters partly because it will help understand some of the data that I'm going to talk about collecting later. But also I just wanted to mention it because this was one of the first things that I learned when I was being trained to catch birds, and it sort of blew my mind how different they were handling them. They bend in all different ways than you would expect. They're not like little feathered mice. They're a completely different creature. Okay. So I'm talking about catching birds. How do you catch a bird? Well, the way that I've always done it and the way that, that is most common is by using something called a mist net. A mist net is a very large, wide, vertical net made of threads that are very thin. So on the right, that's a picture of a crane fly perching on a mist net, and you can see that the threads of the net are about the same thickness as the crane fly's legs. The reason that you want the threads to be really thin is they basically disappear if you don't know they're there. I've known that a net is there and still almost walked into it. I've definitely seen people who don't know it's there walk straight through it or try to. And birds will try to do the same thing. So they will be flying, going about their normal business, and they won't see the net, and then they will fly into the net. The net is bouncy, sort of elasticy. So when they fly in, they sort of slowly bounce, and then they fall down into a little pocket that sort of cradles them in a safe way. And that looks like this. So these are birds that are hanging in the net. We're about to get them out of the net. They generally look sort of angry, as these guys do. They'll often hold on to the net with their feet. Sometimes they'll bite the net. And I am telling you how we catch them, but I do want to reiterate that you should not catch them without training. This is not a thing to try at home. You actually, it would be illegal to do it. You need federal and state permits and lots of training to do this. So not something to try on your own. Although if you are interested in it, you can volunteer at banding stations and learn how to do it. And in fact, I learned how to do it by volunteering at San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory. So once we have our bird out of the net, we want to be collecting data on it. We do this by hand in physical worksheets, and then they get entered into the computer later, but they are taken on paper. And we collect data on things like the species, the age, the sex, the condition, and then we take measurements of these birds. And we want to make sure we're collecting data that you actually need to catch the bird to collect, because if we could just tell by looking through binoculars, we should just look through binoculars. But something like a measurement you can only take if you have the bird in hand. And so you might measure something like the bill. Here we're measuring the bill depth of this blue-black grosbeak. And why might you want to measure a bird's bill? Well, a bird's bill is its main food handling tool. And so measuring their bills can tell you things about what they're eating, what food is available. Lots of evolutionary breakthroughs have actually come about through studying bird bills. So you may have heard about Darwin studying Darwin's finches in the Galapagos. He helped develop his theory of natural selection by looking at bill variation in the finches there. And then about a century and a half later, researchers studied those birds again and looked at how their bill size was related to the seeds that were available during El Nino and La Nina years. And again, sort of clarified how evolution by natural selection works. So we can figure out a lot about big questions and small questions by looking at bird bills. Sometimes it's a small question, like, you know, why does that hummingbird on the left have that curvy bill? And the reason is because he specializes on flowers that are curvy. So yeah. You can also tell individual things about the birds. So the bird on the right there, who has a very impressive long bill, actually his bill is much shorter than it will eventually be. He's a baby, and so his bill is still growing. And we know he's a baby because we measured his bill and compared that to records of adult bills and saw that it was still short. We look at things like eye color. So eye color can often also tell you a bird's age. Young birds tend to have a sort of a cloudy color to the eye as opposed to a clear color in the adults. This can be very subtle. It sometimes takes people like many decades to be able to see it. I have seen people who are really experts at it and can age a bird just by looking at the eye, and it's very impressive. I'm not quite there yet. It's really a specialized skill. Sometimes you can tell other things from a bird's eye. So if you look on the right, we have a bush tit, and you'll notice that her eye is sort of brown but turning gold. And that's because she's a young bird, and a young bush tit always has a brown eye. But she's growing up, and female bush tits have golden eyes. So just by looking at her eye, we can tell you that she is a young female. Quick reminder, looking at our bird anatomy lesson here, notice the triangular indentation right between the two breast muscles at the base of the throat. We're going to look at that. And the reason we're going to look at that is because that is where birds like to store their fat. So mammals like to store their fat sort of all over. Birds like to do it in a few specific places, and one of those places is in that little triangle. And we can look at that on birds. These birds are fine. We have not shaved them. We have not done anything terrible to them. All we're doing is blowing air on them to make their feathers get out of the way. It's just like a breeze. And you're looking at the breast of both of these birds. And on the left, you can see that triangle at the base of the neck. And you can see that this bird does not have very much fat. So that triangle has, is an indentation, and there's not much in there. That doesn't mean that the bird is unhealthy. It just means that she's not super fat right now. On the right, that is a bird who is very fat. So you see there's no indentation at all. There's just sort of a paler part to the bird where that indentation should be. That's all fat. That bird has filled up that area completely with fat. And that probably means that it's about to migrate. Birds usually get really fat right before they're about to migrate. You might also notice that the bird on the left seems to be more naked than the bird on the right. The bird on the left sort of has no feathers in this one area on the breast. The bird on the right is a little bit fuzzy. The bird on the left is breeding right now, and it has something called a brood patch. So when birds are sitting on their eggs or sitting on young nestlings, they will drop all their feathers just on the lower side of them, on their breast and belly. And that way they can more efficiently heat the eggs and the babies, so they can put their warm skin right on the eggs. So just by having these birds and looking at them, we can tell that the bird on the left, say, is sort of moderate condition and is sitting on eggs or young nestlings, and the bird on the right is fat and about to migrate and not incubating right now. You can also tell birds' ages by looking at their skulls. So you might have noticed in the previous pictures that birds seem to be slightly see-through in their skin, that you can see the fat under the skin. It's kind of weird, like you can't do that in mammals. But that's true, birds have this sort of see-through skin, and that means that if you gently part the feathers on a bird's head, you can actually see the skull. And because young birds have skulls that are less ossified, that is, they have less bone in the skull, and adult birds have more bone in the skull, you can actually look through the skin and see that just by, sort of moving their head feathers apart and peeking at the skull. So that's another way to age birds. And you can age birds by looking at molt. So molt is where birds drop old feathers and grow new feathers in. You want to do this if you're a bird because those old ratty feathers will have less surface area for flying. It'll be harder to fly if you have old ratty feathers. When they grow in new feathers, these new feathers are darker. So if you look at the feathers indicated by the red bars in these pictures, hopefully you can see, first of all, they're a little shorter because they're still growing in, but they're also darker than the surrounding feathers, and that's because they haven't been faded by the sun. So birds' feathers actually fade in the sun over time. So those are all pretty standard things that we can do for birds, but sometimes when you have a bird in the hand, you notice something that you're not expecting. This is a white-whiskered puffbird. He lives in Ecuador, and when I was banding in Ecuador and we got one, I was excited because I'd never caught this kind of bird before. And the guy I was with had caught puffbirds before. And I was saying, look at this cool bird, it looks like a Muppet. And he said, yeah, why don't you smell it? And I said, okay, and smelled it and went, because they smell like death. They smell terrible. They smell like kind of like musty, rotting meat. And it's because they live in holes and they eat meat. And so I guess they're maybe, messy eaters and leave bits of their meals around the holes. But they're these gorgeous birds that just smell terrible. And I've never met a smelly bird before or since. Even stranger, there are some birds that are toxic. So this is a hooded pitahui. It lives in New Guinea. This is not my picture. I've never banded them. But if you touch them and then you touch your eyes or you touch some food, and then eat the food, you will feel numbness and burning. And that is because they have a neurotoxin in their feathers and in their skin. We're pretty sure they get it from beetles that they eat. And we're really not sure why, because we're really not sure why. Normally it would be a defense against, being eaten, but in the case of the birds, it's a little odd because most bird predators don't, sort of lick them and then see if they get burning. But in any case, they are the only toxic birds that are known. And this was only discovered by Western researchers when folks were banding them and discovered that, their eyes were burning. Of course, the indigenous folks had known about this for ages. Yeah, so you can get some surprises when you are handling birds. So we take all these data, but the most important thing we do when we catch a bird isn't actually to take any of that data. Instead, it's to put this metal leg band on the bird. It's basically a flat bracelet. We make sure that it's sized so that it will stay on the leg, it won't slide over the foot. And engraved on it is a number, and that number is unique to that bird. So no other bird has that number. And what that means is that once you have that number, you can find the data that anybody recorded for that bird in the database. So the Bird Banding Lab in the US maintains a database of all the data that folks have collected on all banded birds. You can put bands even on hummingbirds. They are very small and very light. Of course, we want to make sure the birds can fly, so they're extremely light. But you can still band them, and they have tiny, tiny little numbers on there. So why are we giving these birds bracelets? Well, the hope is that we will release these birds and then catch them again. What you really want to get data from birds is recaptures. So a recapture is when you capture a bird you've already captured. And that's what's happened to this common yellowthroat right here. You can see he's hanging in the net, but he already has a band, which means that we've caught him before. And that's a big deal, because as soon as you've caught a bird multiple times, now you have information about that bird at multiple points in its life. And that can help us understand things about these wild animals that we really can't understand in any other way. In the US, and well, in North America, we have a pretty extensive banding station network. It could always be bigger. I always want there to be more banding stations. But you can see we have a number of banding stations. And this is actually a subset. This is just a specific type of banding station depicted here. But the idea with all of these stations banding birds is that hopefully they will catch birds that the other stations have also caught. And then we can look at things like, where are birds going? Right? If a bird was banded in one location and caught in another location, now you know it went to these two locations, it took it this long to go there. You can look at things like, does this species often make this journey? Bird banding is how we know most of what we know about bird migration routes. Things like what are important sites to conserve so that the birds can successfully make their migration, which wintering sites have birds that then go to which summering sites. All this movement data comes out of catching these birds multiple times. You can look at how old birds are. So I talked a lot about aging them, right? And one reason we're doing that is so that we can then look at survival rates. And so if we notice a population where the survival rate is crashing, we can direct resources toward that population. If we notice that maybe adults are doing fine, but juveniles are in trouble, we can look at why that might be happening. It lets us see what is going on. It also, just sort of for fun, lets us look at how long birds can live. So you can Google longevity records for your favorite species and find records for the oldest known individuals for that species. So for example, the oldest known song sparrow was over 11 years old. And if you encounter birds multiple times throughout their life, you can also sort of follow the story of their life, essentially. So you might catch a bird as a skinny juvenile who seems to not be doing great, and then catch him again as, as a fat adult who is doing well, and then catch him when he's breeding, and then maybe catch him when he has a leg injury, and then catch him when the leg injury is healed. And you can kind of follow this whole story if you catch the birds enough. And that's rare, but it does happen. There's a few birds at Coyote Creek Field Station where we've caught them, a few times every year for 5 or 6 years. And it's really fun to go in and see, what their life story is. So those are all sort of standard bird banding data endeavors. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of personal projects of mine that focus on bird behavior. So I can't possibly talk about every kind of project you can do on birds because there's just so much out there. So arbitrarily, I'm going to focus on what I think is really cool, which is bird behavior and some work I've done. So first, I'm going to talk about a project about who are your friends? Who are the birds' friends? And then second, I'm going to talk about birdie secrets. So I mentioned that we capture birds in mist nets, but what I didn't mention is that often we don't just capture one bird in the mist net. We will often find multiple birds in the mist net together. So on the left there is a trio of baby Bewick's wrens that were all caught together at the same time. On the right is a pair of white-bearded manakins who were caught in a mist net at the same time. And these captures are a sort of glimpse into the birds' social lives, because if they're caught in the net at the same time, you know that they were together in the same place at the same time. And it really makes you wonder, what were they doing? Why were they there? And so I got interested in whether we could actually find out what they were doing, or infer from banding station data what their social behavior looks like. So the way you do this is using something called social network analysis. It's basically looking at who do you hang out with, who are you found near, and we often depict it visually because it's easier to think about visually. And so you get diagrams like these little diagrams you see where I've drawn pictures of birds and then there's lines between them. The lines indicate some association, so being found in the same net at the same time, say. And you can look for patterns in the shapes of these diagrams. So I've put age and sex into these little cartoons. If you're familiar with common yellowthroats, it will be familiar. The males have masks and the females don't. The adults have brighter yellow on the chest and the juveniles don't. If you're not familiar, it's probably hard to see, but don't worry too much about it. But look at diagram A there on the left for a second and think about, do you see any pattern with relation to age, with relation to the yellow, that is impacting who's associated with whom? What I hope that you might notice is that it looks like the young birds are associating with each other and associating with the adults, and the adults are really not associating with other adults at all. So this hypothetical network would be an example of an age-structured social network where birds of different ages are behaving differently. On the right, we have the same little cartoons, but we have different lines. And again, take a second to see if you can see any pattern in who's being associated with whom there. And you might notice that it looks like all the males are associated and all the females are associated, but they're not associating with each other. So that's an example of a sex-structured social network right there, where the sexes have different behavior. So these are patterns we could, in theory, detect by looking at who gets caught in the net at the same time. But of course, it's much easier with 6 little cartoon birds. So let me show you what it looks like with real data. These are common yellowthroats at Coyote Creek Field Station for one 6-month period in 2018. The left and the right pictures are the same. I've just color-coded them differently. So the left picture is color-coded by age, where green is young birds and blue is adult birds. On the right, I've color-coded them by sex. I'm only showing you 6 months of data because if you look at more, it just gets really messy and hard to understand, hard to take in. But when I run these analyses, I'm using more than 20 years of data from Coyote Creek Field Station, so quite a lot of data. And when I run the analyses and ask whether there is age structure or sex structure in these social networks, whether age or sex impacts how these birds behave, you actually find that it does. So it turns out that young common yellowthroats prefer to hang out with other young common yellowthroats. The young ones hang out with the young ones. And that female common yellowthroats are found with other females more often than they are with males. You can ask similar questions about different species. So these 3 sparrow species sometimes are seen foraging together. So we know that they do hang out together sometimes. And you can ask, do they prefer to associate with their own species or with different species? And again, I'm just showing you 6 months of data here, but I'm using a lot more than that to run these analyses. And what you find is that they do actually associate more with their own species than with other species. You can see they are hanging out in mixed flocks. You do see dots of different colors connected to each other, but they are more likely to associate with their own species. So you can figure out what the birds are doing, right? Those are all patterns of what are the birds doing. What they don't tell us is why. And I always really want to know why. Yeah, are the birds, are they associating because they want to be associating with each other? Are they associating because there's a lot of bugs right there and they just all want to be there eating the bugs? What is driving these associations? And there is a way to use an analysis to see if the patterns are driven by geography, essentially, by space. So by something like a stream, say Coyote Creek Field Station is right next to Coyote Creek, so there are geographical features that might shape where birds go. So you can run an analysis to see, are those geographic features driving these patterns? And if you do that on the results I just showed you, you find that for the sparrows, the geographic location is driving that pattern. So it's not necessarily that sparrows don't like the other species, it's that they have a different way of using the landscape. And so that's causing them to be together. The common yellowthroats, on the other hand, are not explained by geography. So the females hanging out with females and young birds hanging out with young birds, that you can't explain just by landscape. For the birds in these 2 pictures, because they are individual birds that I know pretty well, I actually can tell you what was going on with them, which is sort of satisfying. So I'll just say that the birds on the left, those 3 Bewick's wrens, those are all babies of the same age, which we know because we can look at molt and skull and all those things. They were all caught in the same place. And so you can be pretty certain that they are all siblings. They're all from one brood. They've got parents who are feeding them all together, and so that's why they're hanging out together. The birds on the right, these 2 male manakins, are hanging out together, and so this is one of these cases where you have to be careful with data because you might think hanging out together means they like each other, but actually they're almost certainly one of them was chasing the other one out of its territory, and then they both hit the net. These birds display in sort of big groups for the females, but within those big groups, they have teeny little territories that they defend pretty aggressively. And so one of them probably trespassed and the other one chased him, and then there was a misnet in the way. So I told you about those metal leg bands, but there is a different kind of leg band you can put on a bird, and that is colored leg bands. What you see here is a very young junco who's just got his colored leg bands. So I noticed somebody in the chat mentioned juncos. So yeah, here's the beginning of the junco part of the talk. So I did my dissertation on juncos in the Sierra Nevada mountains, so I'm a big junco fan. This baby is just old enough to get his bands. So you can't band a bird until their legs are adult-sized legs. And juncos grow their legs way faster than they grow the rest of their bodies. So his body is still small, his wing is still small, but his legs are grown-up legs because they grow their legs really fast. So he can have adult leg bands now. And I think Serena mentioned that the next Birdie Hour talk by Dr. Bruce Lyon is going to feature a lot of color banded sparrows. So that would be fun to check out also. So why do we give them color bands? Well, the thing about color bands is it lets you identify birds from afar. So you can, hide in a bush and look through your binocs and see who that bird is. And you really can't do this with those metal leg bands. They have the numbers on them, but there is no way to read them from afar. So color bands let you keep track of individuals. And if you want to study behavior where you keep track of what individuals are doing, you really need to color band them. In these pictures, it looks like it's pretty simple to see who's got which color bands. I will say that in real life, it can be very tricky. The birds are very good at hiding one leg or sitting on it or doing all sorts of things that make it very difficult to tell who is who. But in theory, you watch them and see their color bands and you can tell who it is. This is a nest of very young baby juncos. They all are begging for food. And so, yeah, so they're all begging for food. Their parents will come and bring them bugs. So here's some junco parents with bugs. We've got the dark male in the back. We've got the paler female in the front. This is sort of classic bird parental behavior. I think it's one reason a lot of people like birds is that it's sort of relatable. They have these little nuclear families. It's very sort of Norman Rockwell-ish animal behavior. And even ornithologists thought that it was basically this sort of romantic ideal of, the pair of parents take care of their babies and everything's cute and fine. Until about 30 years ago, which is when we got pretty good at looking at DNA and using DNA to figure out who's related to whom. At which point, somebody thought to look at whether these male birds, these dads, were related to the chicks that they're feeding. And it turns out that quite often they are not. So if you run paternity analysis on birds, often those chicks are not actually genetically related to the dad who is feeding them. This startled actually a lot of ornithologists. Everyone's used to it now, but if you look at work from the time, people were pretty surprised because they were not expecting that. If you watch birds, if you try to just watch the behavior, you don't see the females, hanging out with other males. You don't see this happening. They're very secretive. And so it's really only by looking at the genetic data that we figured this out. And yeah, so I was curious whether this was going on in the juncos up in the mountains. Nobody had looked at that. And so I color banded the juncos to see who was mated to whom, right? Which male was matched with which female. And then they would have a nest and raise the babies, and I would color band the babies. And I would also color band all the neighbors because the neighbors are sort of the potential outside dads. And I would collect a little bit of genetic material from the birds. This is just a drop of blood. We've actually done studies. We know that it's perfectly safe for the birds to give one small drop of blood. It doesn't impact their lives. Yeah, so you can collect DNA and you can look for whether the chicks are related to the junco that is feeding them. And in the juncos up in the mountains, it turns out that out of 60 nests that I was able to test, 38% had at least one chick whose dad was not the dad that was feeding those chicks. So yeah, so it's definitely happening. This is a slightly higher rate than normal for birds, but it's well within sort of unsurprising bounds. Yeah, so the females are sneaking out a little bit on their males. And one thing that I find interesting about this, well, I find this very interesting for many reasons, but I guess one thing that just makes me happy about this kind of research is that you know a secret that even the male junco doesn't know, right? He thinks he's feeding his own chicks. And yeah, so that's kind of cool. But again, I want to know why, right? You don't just want to know, okay, they're doing this thing. You want to know why. Why is she picking these other males? What is she looking for? And in juncos, the sort of flashy signal, the thing they use to impress each other is their tails. So juncos, when they're trying to either scare each other or to court each other, they will flare their tail feathers, and then you can see really clearly they have white tail feathers on the outside. And the amount of white on those tail feathers varies among individuals. So some birds have very little white and some birds have a lot. And in the bottom there, you can see two examples of juncos where I'm spreading their tails just so you can see. And I've numbered the feathers so that you can compare them between the birds. So if you just look at the feather labeled R4 there, you'll notice that in the bird on the left, it's completely dark. And in the bird on the right, it's completely white. So they can differ in, whole feathers in how much white they have. And it's thought that having more white is attractive, but this has only been shown in labs. So, if you take a bird in an aviary and you give her an option between two males, she picks the male with more white. But it hadn't been shown in the wild because, how would you do that in the wild, right? They're wild, they're flying around. But these genetic data for these chicks where the females are choosing between their own mate and neighboring males actually give us an opportunity to look at whether juncos are paying attention to tail white in the wild. And what we find is that they are. So this graph is showing you the amount of tail white. So a higher up point is more tail white. And on the left, we have the males, the neighboring males who were siring chicks in nests that were not their own. And on the right, we have the social dads that were feeding these chicks, even though the chicks were not necessarily related to them. And you see that the females overall were choosing to mate with males that had more white on their tails than their social mates. So this tail white is attractive, and the female is mating with these other males in order to presumably get those attractive genes for her chicks so that her chicks will also be attractive. So I've talked tonight about just some of the things we learned by catching birds, things like migratory routes, survival rates, social behavior, and maybe even what female birds find attractive. I hope that you're convinced that there's some benefit in catching birds, and also that, that you've enjoyed it. And I'm very grateful for you all for coming, and I'll be here for questions.
All right, our first question is from Pete. There are so many banded Forster's terns in our area with federal bans only. Is there any hope for recaptures?
Ooh, you would want a Forster's tern expert, I think, for that. I would say that even if you don't catch them very often, it's still really valuable to band birds because that's, the fact that you're not catching them tells you that something's going on, right? It might tell you that survival's really low. It might tell you that they're all going somewhere you don't know about and you need to go look for where that is. So even if you're not catching them again, you can get good information. But yeah, I don't know about the Forster's terns. Sorry.
Yeah, if anybody knows, feel free to chime in the chat. Okay. Let's see, Linda asked, do males have brood patches too? And Josh, presumably, Land Bird Program Director, Josh, but maybe there's another expert. So males, he says that males that incubate eggs like woodpeckers will develop brood patches, but the brood patches are usually not as extensive as in females. Let's see, and Maureen also added that brood patches aren't usually visible when you look at the bird. The other
That's a good point. Yeah.
The brood patch.
Yeah, you do have to hold the bird and blow the feathers out. It looks like they're very naked, but actually the feathers totally cover it if you just see the bird walking around. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you have anything else to add about males with brood patches?
No, I think Josh got it. Yeah. I mean, you don't need it unless you're going to sit on the eggs. So for the birds where the males don't sit on the eggs, they don't bother. Yeah.
Cool. And Florence asked, do you always band every bird you catch?
That's a good question. So there's a few cases where you wouldn't. Well, so it depends what your goal is. So when I was studying the juncos, sometimes we would accidentally catch something that wasn't a junco, and we wouldn't ban those because we were just trying to study junco behavior. So in that case, we wouldn't ban them. At a banding station like CCFS, where the point is to band as many birds as you can, you will try to band all the birds. We don't ban hummingbirds at CCFS because they're particularly tricky, and we don't get them that often, and so we've just decided not to go through all that. And if there's a bird that we can't identify, this almost never happens, but if there's a bird where we just can't figure out what species it is, we won't band it because you do have to know the species. But that's very unusual.
And Steve asked, do you collect DNA samples from birds?
Yeah. So generally, you only do that if you have a project in mind. So like CCFS doesn't do that, as a standard thing. But when I was looking at paternity in the juncos, I would do it. Yeah.
Claire says that I always kind of assumed that birds mostly ignored other species of birds that aren't predators or prey. This is probably more of an observed behavior question, if it's answerable at all, but I'd be interested to hear a little bit about what we know about non-predator prey interspecies interactions.
That's a great question. I'm not going to be able to cover all of it. But yeah, we do know that birds pay attention to each other. So one way that you can see this, at least in the Bay Area, is you'll see sometimes these mixed flocks. So especially in the winter, you'll get flocks of multiple species of birds. Often it's chickadees, juncos, and maybe a brown creeper hopping along the trees. And in that case, what they're doing is they're all benefiting from each other looking out for a predator, and they're also foraging together. But they've sort of weighed the costs and benefits and decided it's better to compete for food while also looking out for hawks. So you can get these sort of cooperative relationships. We know now that chickadees, when they give a warning call, that lots and lots of species listen for those warning calls and actually get warned by the chickadees. So they can sort of cooperate in that way. They can definitely fight over food just because something's another species. If it's eating your food, you can still be mad. You probably see that at your bird feeders. Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna keep going, but it's a very interesting topic. Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, and Iway had added that birds pay attention to each other or other species for signs of danger or locating food. So yeah, we touched on those. Iway also asked, has anyone looked at whether the dads feed chicks differently if they're not related to him?
Yes. So yes, because we all think that they should, right? So they don't. And the main thought about that is just that he has no idea, right? He doesn't know. And so he feeds them all. And the thing is that even if he knew that his female, even if he saw her like sneaking off and then coming back from the neighbors, he doesn't know if, one chick is not his chick. There's still 3 other chicks that are his, and he doesn't know which one isn't his. So if he stops feeding them, he loses his own chicks too. So yeah, so it seems like they're sort of trapped in this situation where they need to feed them. But I will say often males lose paternity in their own nests, but then have a chick or two in a different nest. So sometimes it sort of averages out to being about the same anyway.
Jill asked, could feeding be by the grandfather?
So in juncos, probably not, because it's pretty much just the parents, unless someone gets confused. But there are birds where you have like cooperative breeding, where relatives can help feed offspring. So that could happen in something like an acorn woodpecker. Although usually what happens there is that it's not that the grandparents help the offspring, it's that the offspring, it's that the kids hang out and raise their siblings, essentially. So, so birds never get so old that they can't breed. So, you know, humans, we get to the point where we can't have more babies, and then you become, you know, a grandparent and you help take care of your grandkids. Birds, as far as we know, can always reproduce. There's an albatross named Wisdom who is, I want to say 50 now, and just laid an egg. So they can always reproduce. So what happens there is generally the oldest birds get priority and they make their kids help raise their siblings. Yeah.
Okay. Now, Victor noted that there were some pictures of birds with 4 bands, with the color bands,
Yeah.
and is concerned about whether that's okay for them, if they can still fly with all that.
Yes, that's a great question. Yeah, so 4 is generally the maximum. You have to get special permission to put any more, and I would not do that. The bands are incredibly light. So the metal band is this aluminum that weighs basically nothing, and the plastic bands are even lighter. They'll literally, if you put them down on the table, they blow away. It's very annoying, actually. Yeah, so we're definitely always mindful of that. We care about the birds. And the other thing is, if you're studying bird behavior and you're changing the bird behavior, like, then there's no point, right? If we're weighing down the birds, then all of our conclusions are wrong. So we're really motivated not to change the bird's behavior.
Let's see, Lawrence asked, with those juncos with mixed parents, did the female lay the eggs at the same time with different male parents?
Yeah, so basically, yes. Birds only lay 1 egg a day. So if she lays 4 eggs, it took her 4 days. But yeah, there wouldn't have been a gap in time or anything. Birds can store sperm, and there's actually some evidence that they can select among, like, if she mates with 2 males, then she can pick which one fertilizes the egg. We do not understand the mechanisms of that, but it's pretty amazing. But yeah, no, so timing would not be a good cue to anybody. Yeah.
So cool. Jean asked, are the band colors consistent across bird banding stations? For example, if we saw a pink banded bird, could we check a database to find out what kind of bird it was?
So no and yes. So bird band colors, generally you only use colors if you're doing like a specific behavioral project. So the banding station wouldn't use colors. That's a lot of that is because you run out of colors really fast. So if you just think about how many colors you could distinguish with your eyes, right? And think about, you only have 4 bands. And you could do, you know, blue, green, red, orange, yellow. And then you don't want to use white or black with juncos because they have white and black on the tails. You don't want to like use colors they care about. For a golden crowned sparrow, like in this picture here, you wouldn't want to use a yellow band probably because they might, you know, yellow is on their heads, and so they might pay attention to a yellow band. So there's some colors you can't use. And then you could try to use like light blue and maybe dark blue, and then could you do turquoise, but then turquoise in shadow maybe looks like dark blue. So really quickly you run out of colors and run out of combos. So banding stations don't do it in general, it's just individual projects. But if you see a color banded bird, you can absolutely look it up. If you go to the Bird Banding Lab's website, there's forms for reporting color banded birds. And so you won't know the number, right, because you won't have caught it, but they will know who in your area is color banding birds of that species. So if somebody saw a color banded junco in the Sierras, they would report it to the lab. I would get an email and it would say, hey, someone saw this bird. Can you, tell them what's going on? And then I can tell them what's going on. Yeah, and please do, if you see them, report it, because it's really fun for us to hear about our birds. And it's also valuable data because now we know, the bird is alive and the bird is there and all those things.
Let's see, Juniper asked regarding the juncos, why wouldn't the females choose males with more white feathers as mates instead of settling for males with less white feathers and then going after non-mate males?
Yeah, it seems a little convoluted, doesn't it? The problem is those really attractive males, there's a limited number of them, right? So, think about like the most attractive males, they're by default, they're the most, there won't be enough of them for all the females. So we do know actually in juncos too that there are things that make females more attractive. And so almost certainly those males are mating with the most attractive females. And so if you're a female who can't compete, you have to settle for your mate, but then maybe you can sneak in some of those good genes, yeah.
Mickey asked, where can we see additional anatomical drawings?
Oh, yeah, so those are by Katrina von Grau, and she has 2 books out, and they're really cool. I recommend them. The one that those are from is called The Unfeathered Bird. Yeah, and it's just all drawings like that. She went to museums, she did a lot of like studying, and then she also did a lot of bird watching. And so she has lots of, yeah, of anatomical birds doing real things. It's cool.
Okay, Maureen, who had added earlier too that some hatching locations band with specific colors. Maureen asked, how are the South Bay snowy plovers color banded?
Yeah, so I'm not the SFBBO person you want for that, but I will answer it anyway, because I'm here. So yeah, so birds like the plovers are really tricky because they're called precocial, where the birds hatch and almost immediately they can run away. So think about like ducklings, shorebirds, anything like that, they hatch and then they're mobile. Which is very different from the juncos where they sit in the nest for 12 days. So you have lots of time to go and get them and band them. So with the plovers, they have to really keep track of those nests and know exactly when they're gonna hatch. And then they have to go and band them in, they have just like a few hours really where the babies have hatched, but they're not quite sort of energized enough to go running away. And we know where they are, and you have to go catch them then and band them then. And then after that, they're running off following their parents, and yeah.
Yeah, and Josh also added that the plover color bands are coordinated throughout the West Coast, so individuals
oh, that's cool.
Identified, yeah, to their regional banding location, regardless of where they turn up. Many color banding projects aren't coordinated on a large scale like that, though. So yeah, good information.
Yeah, that's actually, I mean, that just goes to show that not everyone's coordinated, because I've done color banding juncos and I had no idea. Yeah.
Fiona asked, are there any programs in Northern California that offer banding certifications?
Yeah, so the North American Banding Council, the NABC, I think that's right, you can be a certified bander, and you can be, if you're really good, you can be a certified bander trainee, which means you can train other people. But so they sort of do the final test, but a lot of the training, I guess you could probably get trained fully through doing their workshops, but I think it would be expensive. Most people do like an internship or volunteering at bird projects to get most of their training. And then the certification is sort of a final step. It's a test, and it's not, so I'm actually not officially certified. I've had the permit. I've had, I'm allowed to do it. The certification is not a legal thing. It's more like a, I don't know, a thing that bird banders have organized. I'm studying for it. I want to get it, but it's sort of later on when you have a lot of experience. It's to demonstrate that you really have a lot of experience.
So Karen says that they're curious about the culture of bird banding volunteers. Birders often like to collect sightings. Do banders keep lists of species they've handled or caught? And can this be problematic?
Oh, so I keep lists of birds that I've handled. So I guess I can say that I do. I'm sure I'm not the only one who does it. We certainly encourage new trainees to keep a count of how many birds they've banded, because that's sort of evidence of how much practice you've had. Can this be problematic? I imagine it could. You wouldn't want to catch a cool bird and then have 6 people all need to hold it, because the bird would get stressed out. But everywhere I've been, we've been, quite good about that. People will peek at a bird as someone else bands it, and things like that. But yeah, I think folks who go into bird banding, they really put the birds first. So yeah, I mean, even if you'd really like to, like, I've definitely watched someone band a kingfisher and been like, I wish I was banding the kingfisher, but there's still a kingfisher. It's cool.
Right. Let's see. And Karen also asked mentioned that wisdom is actually 66, which is.
Oh, that's great. I should really remember that number because it's more impressive than 50. Yeah. Isn't that amazing? That's the albatross, in case anyone is not keeping up. That was the albatross that's laying eggs still.
And Fiona asked, in your junco research, did you notice females having a preference for certain color bands?
So I was worried about that, because I definitely don't want to be messing with their attractiveness, right? I don't want to be, accidentally making birds less attractive or more attractive. So I was very careful to not use colors that I thought they would pay attention to. I was reassured because the things that we know juncos look at are the dark hood and the tail, and not anything on the feet. So you'd want to be a lot more cautious if you had a bird that had, say, bright red legs, right? Because then color banding them, the birds are already looking at the legs. That could be a problem. So I definitely looked into the literature and made sure that wasn't an issue. Folks have studied this a lot, and there's a few species that pay attention to color bands, but they're all species that signal using color. And so they're paying attention to those specific colors. And so with the juncos, I didn't use white bands because I was worried about the tail white. And so I think we avoided that.
And you mentioned the dark hoods. So Florence asked, in juncos, does a darker head mean an older male?
Ooh, I love that hypothesis, and I don't think I have an answer for that. Nobody, as far as I know, has demonstrated that, certainly. Yeah, I don't know. There's variation in hood color geographically. So like in the Bay Area, it's pretty easy to tell females from males because males have darker hoods. Up in the mountains, a lot of the females had like male looking hoods. So I know there's geographic variation. Yeah, I don't know if it changes over time. That's a really interesting question.
Yeah, not to mention all the different subspecies as well.
Yeah, well, and I can only speak to the ones that I studied. Yeah, because yes, there's lots of flavors of juncos.
Danielle asked, do you have any other interesting facts that you can share about juncos?
Let's see. They have bigger repertoires than you would think. You might think they sort of have one song, but actually they usually have 10-ish or more songs. But you have to listen to them forever to hear all of the songs because they don't change up the songs like ever. So I wanted to study the songs as part of, to go along with the tale, but I just couldn't because we calculated that you'd have to record the bird for like 48 hours to get all of the songs. We didn't have time. Yeah, the juncos that have been studied a lot are the East Coast juncos, the slate colored juncos. There's been a ton of work done on them because there's this lab in Indiana led by Dr. Ellen Ketterson that's been going for decades and doing all kinds of really cool stuff. And also all her, well, not all her, but many of her students go on to found their own labs and study them. So if you look up juncos, you mostly learn about those juncos. And when I was planning for my birds, I was, using her papers as a reference to figure out how to handle my birds. And what I discovered is that those birds they act like a different species, basically. They're very different from our Oregon juncos. They're bigger and have a completely different temperament than our Oregon juncos.
Cool, all right. That is the last question I see in the chat window right now. If anybody comes up with anything at the last second, please feel free to type those in. So Katie, do you have any last things you want to say or, to the audience or just in general?
Yeah, thanks for coming, and keep an eye out for those banded birds and report them to the bird banding lab if you can, because yeah, that would be really helpful.